Dr. Sandra Waddock is the Galligan Chair of Strategy, Carroll School Scholar of Corporate Responsibility, and Professor of Management in the Carroll School of Management at Boston College. She was a co-founder of the Leadership for Change program, Sustainability, Responsibility, and Community at Boston College, and the Initiative for Responsible Investing, which is now here at Harvard, and continues to flourish because there continue to be things that need to be said about responsible investing. Also widely published, Dr. Waddock is the author of Building the Responsible Enterprise, Where Vision and Values Add Value. And I just learned today she has a forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press called Intellectual Shamans. These are two words that don't often go together, but I think they reflect a recent piece she'd published, which we thought was absolutely brilliant and something worth having on the panel today. And she's here to talk about wisdom, so we can begin with the question, how does wisdom relate to intrinsic and other types of motivation that we're discussing today?
Thanks, Bill, and thank you, Manuel, for inviting me. And I'm thrilled to hear about dignity. That was just wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about intellectual shamans and also about people I call difference makers. So think for a minute about someone who inspires you, someone that you trust, to go back to Manuel's framework. And think about for a minute, what is it that inspires and what is it that you trust? And chances are, I'm going to argue that these individuals are going to have a multiplicity of motivational attributes along the line of the framework that we just heard about. The intrinsic, the transitive, and the spiritual, or in the sort of language that we were just talking about. In my terms, they're on a path to achieving wisdom. Let me explain. I come at this notion of vision in two ways, this wisdom in two ways. One is through some empirical work that I've done over the past few years, and the other is through some intellectual work. And so the article that you discovered is the piece of the intellectual work that I did. And in that piece, I define wisdom as having three core elements. One of those elements is moral imagination, or what is called the good, right? Moral imagination. Moral imagination, according to Pat Warhane, who's done a lot of work in developing this issue, and she's a business ethicist, is the ability to think through the ethical consequences of actions and decisions, to recognize where there are ethical implications in a situation. It reflects an orientation, in my view, towards the good, and it's an intrinsic kind of orientation towards the good. In that sense, it goes well beyond the self, and people who have this sense of moral imagination see the good in not only in situations that they're in, they see where there are problems, ethical problems in situations. And I know Mike Hoffman has done a lot of work in helping people to gain this sense of moral imagination. It is embedded in the lives of both intellectual shamans and in the lives of difference makers, and I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. The second element of wisdom is what I call systems understanding. And here I go back to Peter Senge's seminal work called The Fifth Discipline, published in 1990, republished again in 2006, really thinking about what is it to understand the system. And Donna and I were talking a little bit before the meeting about, I think that people need to have a certain level of cognitive capacity, in Kohlberg's terms, to be at least post-conventional, early stages of post-conventional development, so that they can be systems thinkers, to understand the systems in reasonably accurate ways, or the true, so the good and the true, right? Typically, this way is thinking beyond the self, so it definitely has that transitive or what do you call it? Transcendent orientation to it, and it reflects the true, and it's a holistic understanding of situations. It's what the managers that lack understanding of dignity that Donna was just talking about lack. They don't understand the holistic implications of what is going on in their organizations when they're making decisions and their impacts of those decisions on people. Moral imagination also is a capacity to see the ethical situations. So when you combine those two, you begin to get a better picture of what's actually going on in your organization. The third attribute, and it's one that we don't often think about, is what I call aesthetic sensibility. Aesthetic sensibility is the ability to appreciate the design and aesthetic elements in a situation. So many of the people that I studied really get a sense of the system and say, whoa, they wouldn't frame it exactly this way, but from a design point of view, there's some element missing or some problematic element in this situation. From the individual perspective, it's people aren't being treated with dignity, and there's a flaw in the system. So we have then aesthetic sensibility, or the beautiful, right? So now we have all three elements of the good, the true, and the beautiful. If we think about moral imagination, systems understanding, and aesthetic sensibility, but that's not enough. They need to be used in the service of the greater good. So my definition of wisdom then becomes the integration in the individual of the good, the true, and the beautiful, moral imagination, systems understanding, and aesthetic sensibility in the service of something beyond the self or the greater good. So who are these people that I studied, and what is this notion of intellectual shamanism? Because it really relates. The last chapter of the Intellectual Shamans book is all about wisdom. It really relates to this concept. So the difference makers were 23 individuals who started what I call the corporate responsibility infrastructure. So if you're familiar with all the problems of corporations, you might also be aware that there's a non-governmental set of efforts, lots of them in fact, to build pressures on companies to behave in better ways. So if you've heard of things like the UN Global Compact or the Global Reporting Initiative or social investing or any number of other initiatives, these are people who were pioneers in starting this. And they have these characteristics, although I hadn't been framing their lives in this way when I did the work. There's a book out called The Difference Makers that really it looks at the lives of these people, the organizations they developed, and how this infrastructure developed over its early years. So these difference makers who started out as normal human beings like you and me and were willing to take some risks and put some initiatives in place, and they're not necessarily visionaries. They didn't necessarily have a grand vision when they started, but they can look back on a set of accomplishments that leads them to now claim that they would have a vision. But most of them, when I asked, well, what was your vision? They were like, I don't know. I was grounded in a set of morals. So they had that sort of moral imagination. I knew I wanted to make the world a little bit better, but I didn't quite have an idea of how to do that, so I went ahead and did these things. Well, intellectual shamans. So I got intrigued by the fact that there are some academics. So if you ever go to conferences, any conferences, whether they're academic or not, there's a certain set of people whose sessions you're going to want. You see them on the program, those are the sessions you want to go to. Who are they? What is it about these people that is so appealing and attractive? And I thought, well, let me look at some of these academics, my particular heroes. So my selection criteria from an academic point of view, totally non-rigorous, but they're the people that I admire who've really changed the game in many ways. So if you're familiar with stakeholder theory, you may be familiar with Ed Freeman, who's the father of stakeholder theory. So Ed is one of the people that I interviewed. If you know about Theory U, Otto Scharmer's work at MIT, Otto is one of the people that I interviewed. If you know about Henry Mintzberg and his path-breaking work on strategy, he's another of the people that I interviewed. So I interviewed 28 academics, all of whom had done really significant stuff that allowed them. And I had in the back of my mind, this paper that I had read by Peter Frost. Peter Frost was a really wonderful academic that I actually didn't know. I met him only once. But he had written with Carroll and Egri a couple of papers on organization development people as shamans. Now, and I've been studying shamanism for a number of years with a shaman. And so I thought, well, let me go back to that paper. There was a wonderful framework in there. It became the framework for thinking about these people and the work that they do. So shamans, intellectual shamans, all shamans are healers. They are the oldest spiritual, it is the oldest spiritual tradition in the world. There is no dogma associated with it. It's a healing practice, so shamans are healers, first of all. Shamans also have served two other roles, and intellectual shamans particularly serve these roles well, but all shamans serve them. They are connectors. So they, I call them connectors. Egri and Frost call them boundary spanners or mediators of different realities, because shamans, traditional shamans go into, trance states and they access information from other realms. Well, intellectual shamans are boundary spanners. They cross disciplines. They cross the theory practice boundary. They cross the teaching research boundary. So they're integrating across boundaries. So I call them connectors. They connect ideas from many different realms. And the third role that they play is actually that in the Frost paper, they talk about it as spiritual leadership. But it's a sense-making role. Carroll White talks about this who's one of the people I interviewed, talks about this as sense-making. So one of the problems that in traditional cultures, shamans see that a patient is sick, comes to them, and what they believe is that there's something wrong with the cultural surround, or the mythologies that the patient believes, and that's what's causing the illness. And so they access these other realms, they connect to the universe, my shaman would say, my teacher, and they bring information back to help heal that cultural mythology and to change the situation for the patient. Well, think of what intellectual shamans are doing is there's a broken myth. Maybe it's a set of practices and businesses that are broken. So you go in and you discover that dignity is not being accorded to people. And we know that that's such a foundational element of morality, that people should be treated with respect. If they're not being treated with respect, there's no dignity there. So they go out and they find that, and so we know Donna has at least one of the characteristics of the intellectual shaman, because she's got this healing orientation. She wants to heal organization, and she's connecting ideas that people haven't connected in that way, quite that way before. And then she's going out and making sense of it to people. So that's what the intellectual shaman does. These people come to their work with a clear sense of purpose or values. We could also look at Manuel and the framework he just put together as having a similar kind of orientation, but
just go for it,
everybody. No, but my belief is that the world is in huge trouble today, right? If we think about climate change, if we think about many practices in academia, if we think about many practices in business, if we think about many practices in government, we think about all the conflict in the world that you're so familiar with, then we need many, 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 many more people to become shamans or intellectual shamans if we happen to be academics. They come to their work with a clear sense of purpose, and that we could call that a spiritual motivation. It's almost like a calling for people. And in doing their work, they have to become fully who they are. In other words, if we're academics today, we're under, at least in management schools, under this sort of pressure to produce a lot of A journal articles in my field, hits, and to get our impact factor up there, our citation counts. They don't have that orientation. They have a better sense of purpose. It's about an idea and following the idea and thinking about that idea and making sure that that idea really works in the world. So it's different. It's a different sense of purpose. They have to become, I call it, fully who they are. And in doing that, they serve their purpose, and they're called to that purpose. But that makes them a little strange. Sometimes they are stepping outside of the normal academic boundaries, in the case of intellectual shamans, or they're stepping outside the normal boundaries in organizations. My colleague Judy Neal, who's founded an organization called Spirit at Work, which relates to your framework as well, talks about these people who walk the boundaries in organizations, at the interstitials between different functions, and trying to make the place better, trying to make the organization better or its relationship with stakeholders better. Edge walkers. So these difference makers, edge walkers, and shamans are the people who do the healing work that gets us to all of the levels of motivation that your framework talks about, and who also come to wisdom, I think, in the end, through their work and through reflecting on their work over time. So I guess fundamentally I want to leave you with, I think we all have the capacity to do this shamanic type of work, to come to this form of wisdom, if we're willing to take the risk to do so. So, thank you.